The detention cell was smaller than Keshin had expected for a facility orbiting a class station. He'd imagined something more elaborate, more intentionally cruel. Instead, the walls were merely austere smooth panels of brushed metal that reflected his face back at him in fractured, unflattering ways. 3 days here, and he still couldn't quite believe the accusation they'd leveled against him. Smuggling restricted technology. Him, a freighter captain, whose greatest crime in the past decade had been running relief supplies to colonies. The Galactic Council had deemed economically unviable. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had been running medical supplies through restricted space, yes, but the Meridian Station colony was dying. Their water purification systems had failed 6 months ago, and the bureaucratic channels moved with all the speed of continental drift. So Keshin had done what he'd always done. He'd found a way around the rules. A small way. Harmless, really. Until it wasn't. The guards who'd arrested him at the docking bay had been efficient, which suggested this was less about justice and more about something else entirely. Keshin had learned long ago that when governments moved with that particular kind of precision, there were bigger games being played. He just hadn't expected to be a piece on the board. He sat on the narrow cot bolted to the wall and tried to remember what his therapist had said about breathing exercises. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. He'd gotten through 3 cycles when the door's magnetic lock disengaged with a soft hiss. The guards who entered looked different from the ones who'd brought him food that morning. Their uniforms bore insignia Keshin didn't recognize, not military, at least not in any conventional sense. They carried themselves with the particular grace of people accustomed to wielding power without needing to announce it. "Prisoner Keshin VOR," one of them said. "You're being transferred for formal questioning." Keshin stood, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that did nothing to improve his appearance. He'd been allowed to shower once since his arrest, and his reflection in the polished walls showed the toll those 3 days had taken. Deeper lines around his eyes, the shadow of several days' growth darkening his jaw. The overall appearance of someone whose world had undergone a sudden and unwelcome shift. "Am I finally going to learn what this is actually about?" he asked. "Or are we sticking with the fiction of espionage?" The guard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been appreciation for the question. She gestured toward the door. "Questions will be answered during the interrogation. Step forward." Keshin complied. There was little choice, and he'd learned early in his detention that resistance accomplished nothing beyond physical discomfort. The guards flanked him as they moved through corridors that seemed designed to disorient. The walls curved at intervals that left no clear sense of direction, and the lighting shifted in subtle ways that made time feel uncertain. His mind drifted despite his efforts to stay present. He thought about the Meridian Station colony, about the children he'd seen playing in the habitation dome the last time he'd made a run there, about the way Dr. Morrison had gripped his shoulder with genuine gratitude when he'd unloaded the purification supplies. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely 2 weeks. The interrogation chamber was larger than expected, and configured in ways that suggested formality rather than intimidation. A long table, a single chair positioned before it not bolted down, which struck Keshin as an odd choice until he realized the strategic advantage. If you tried to run, they'd know immediately. But the choice to be cooperative or defiant would be left, ostensibly to him, the figure sitting at the center of the table brought Keshin to a halt despite himself. She was humanoid but distinctly other skin, held a faint iridescence that shifted between silver and deep violet depending on how the light caught it. Her hair was white, not from age but from something intrinsic to her biology, arranged in an elaborate arrangement of braids that seemed to hold their own subtle luminescence. But it was her eyes that arrested him most completely. They were large, tilted slightly upward at the corners, and colored an impossible shade of turquoise that seemed to contain depths. She wore formal attire in shades of deep blue and silver, cut in a style he didn't recognize. Keshin had traveled widely enough to identify people from a dozen different civilizations by their dress. But this was beyond his experience. "Sit," she said, and there was something in her voice that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. It was melodious without being artificial, controlled but not cold. He sat. The guards remained standing behind him, a subtle reinforcement of his prisoner status. "I am designate tribunal representative Thalia Vex," the woman said. "I will be conducting your formal interrogation regarding the charges against you. Do you understand?" Keshin nodded, but kept his gaze steady on her. "I understand that someone's decided to make an example of me for running supplies to a dying colony. What I don't understand is why a tribunal representative is personally conducting the questioning for what you're claiming is a routine smuggling charge." Something flickered across her face, surprise. "Perhaps, or something more complex. You believe your actions were routine?" "I believe my actions were humanitarian," Keshin replied. "The charges are political." Thalia Vex leaned back in her chair, and the gesture held a particular grace. Her eyes never left his face. "You're making assumptions about factors you can't possibly understand." "Probably," Keshin admitted. "But I'm right, aren't I?" She stood abruptly, and Keshin tensed, but she simply moved to the window that overlooked the station's external structures. Her reflection in the transparent panel was haunting, ethereal, and somehow fragile despite the authority she clearly wielded. 3 years ago," she said quietly, "a supply vessel identical to yours made an unauthorized run to a research station in restricted space. That station was conducting illegal weapons development. The supplies they received accelerated their timeline significantly. 17,000 people died in the conflict that followed." Keshin felt his stomach drop. "That wasn't me." "No," she agreed, turning to face him. "But your records indicate a similar pattern. Routes to restricted space, supplies that don't match your registered cargo manifests, a pattern of helping where help is forbidden. There's a difference between helping a civilian colony and enabling weapons development. Is there?" Thalia Vex moved closer, and Keshin became acutely aware of how little distance actually separated them. "Intention is invisible, Captain VOR. Consequences are not. How can I distinguish between noble impulse and calculated treason?" There was something in the way she asked the question that suggested she genuinely wanted to know, not simply to argue. Keshin found himself answering with more honesty than his situation probably warranted. "You can't," he said. "Not from the outside. You have to decide whether you're going to assume the best in people or the worst. And that decision usually says more about you than about them." Thalia Vex studied him for a long moment. When she finally moved, it was back to her chair. She sat with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving his. "You may be extraordinarily naive, Captain VOR," she said. "Or you may be the cleverest person I've encountered in quite some time. I haven't yet determined which. How long do I have to convince you?" Keshin asked. "That," she said, "depends on many things. Part 1 word count, approximately 1,300 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? I'm establishing a romance based on mutual recognition and growing understanding across cultural boundaries, rather than the human hero saves alien trope from the original inspiration." The diplomatic quarters assigned to Keshin were substantially more comfortable than the detention cell, which suggested either mercy or a calculated decision to make him cooperative through comfort. He'd learned enough about the bureaucracy of power to recognize that both could be true simultaneously. The room held a bed that didn't fold into the wall, a small table with actual chairs, and a window that overlooked the stations. Central hub, the docking bays, where his freighter was almost certainly being torn apart by forensic experts searching for evidence that didn't exist. 3. Days had passed since his interrogation with Thalia Vex. 3 days of careful neutrality, of meals delivered by silent attendants, of a shower he'd been permitted to take that had genuinely helped his mental state more than he wanted to admit. He'd been told to expect another formal questioning session, but the summons had come differently than expected. Not through guards, but through a message delivered to his quarters in the morning light, filtering through the station's artificial day. Cycle, the tribunal representative requests your presence in the observation gardens. At the second light cycle, alone, Keshin had spent considerable time trying to interpret that message. Official interrogations didn't happen in gardens. Gardens suggested something less formal, which could mean anything from a genuine conversation to an elaborate trap. He'd decided it didn't matter. Cooperation was his only option, and refusing would only make matters worse. The observation gardens occupied an entire sector of the station, a sprawling botanical preserve designed to remind people of planetary surfaces most of them would never actually visit. There were simulated rain cycles and soil that smelled genuine, trees that had been grown under specialized lighting to mimic natural sunlight. Keshin had read about such places, but never been in one. His work took him to industrial stations and dying colonies, not the luxury accommodations of tribunal representatives. Thalia Vex was standing beneath a flowering tree that didn't correspond to anything Keshin recognized. The blossoms were deep purple, releasing a fragrance that made his chest constrict unexpectedly. She wore something different than the formal attire he'd seen during interrogation's simpler clothing in shades of silver and pale blue, and her elaborate braids had been loosened into something more casual. She looked less like a tribunal representative and more like a person, which somehow made her presence more unsettling rather than less. "You came," she said without turning around. "I wasn't certain you would." "Didn't seem like much of a choice," Keshin replied, stopping a respectful distance away. "When a tribunal representative requests your presence, you present yourself." She turned then, and the expression on her face was something he couldn't quite read. "How many interrogations have you endured, Captain Vo?" "None before the one with you," he said honestly. "Why?" "Because I was trying to determine if you're naturally combative, or if you reserve it for situations where you feel threatened." She moved closer, and Keshin noticed that her eyes held that same turquoise depth, but it seemed gentler in the natural light of the gardens. "You were neither in our session. Confrontational, yes, but not threatened." "I didn't feel threatened," Keshin said. "I felt certain about my actions." Innocence is a strange comfort. Thalia Vex smiled, and the expression transformed her face entirely. It was genuine, which meant it was rare enough to be striking. "You have more faith in the justice systems of the galaxy than most beings I've encountered. That either suggests admirable optimism or dangerous naivety." "You keep coming back to that," Keshin observed. "Am I naive, or have you already decided what I am, and you're just waiting for me to slip up?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured toward a path that wound deeper into the garden, beneath overhanging foliage that filtered the light into patterns. They walked without speaking for several minutes, and Keshin became aware of how precisely she moved, as though she was constantly aware of exactly where her body was in space. It was graceful in a way that suggested training or perhaps something intrinsic to her species. "I was on my homeworld," she finally said, 7 years ago. "Not here, not at this station. I was conducting a medical mission to a research colony in disputed space. It's a long story with a predictable ending: political tension, military escalation, a bombardment that wasn't supposed to happen but did anyway." Keshin said nothing. He sensed she needed to tell this story, and interrupting would only derail her. "I was injured in the initial attack." Nothing catastrophic, but enough that I couldn't move quickly. My team had scattered, and I found myself alone in the wreckage of the settlement where we'd been working. She paused beneath an arch of flowering vines. That's when I heard voices. Human voices, actually. A rescue team coming through the ruins, looking for survivors. Keshin's throat tightened. Something in her tone suggested this story had personal significance to him, though he had no idea why. They found me, Thalia continued. Or rather, one of them did. A human from a rescue corps, still in uniform. He was supposed to evacuate his own people, supposed to follow protocol. But he brought me with him anyway. He was injured too. His back was badly burned from the bombardment. But he stayed with me, protected me, until we could be extracted. Keshin found himself asking what happened to him. I never learned his name, she said, and there was something raw in her voice. The extraction was chaotic. Everyone was suffering, barely conscious. By the time I understood what he'd done, understood that he'd risked his career to help someone he'd never met before, he was already being loaded onto a human shuttle. I tried to stop them, tried to explain that he was injured because of me, but it was too late. They took him away. And you never saw him again, Keshin said. No. She looked at him directly then, and her turquoise eyes seemed to hold him in place. I spent years trying to find him. His name, his station, any record of who he was. But the human military had classified everything. It was like he'd been erased. And then, about a week ago, we received notification that a human freighter captain had been found in restricted space, carrying unauthorized supplies. Something was clicking into place in Keshin's mind. The pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was seeing. Thalia, when I saw your file, your name meant nothing to me, she continued. But when I heard your voice during the interrogation, when you spoke about intention and consequence, and deciding whether to assume the best in people, that's when I knew. Keshin's voice came out rough. Knew what? That you were the human from 7 years ago. She stepped closer. I would have known that voice anywhere. I heard it when I was terrified and in pain. I heard it promising me that everything would be all right, even though we both knew it might not be. And then I couldn't find you again, and I spent 7 years thinking I might never hear it again. Keshin felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. That's not possible. I've never met you before this week. I've never been to a tribunal station before my arrest. No, Thalia agreed. You were there 7 years ago, on a research colony in disputed space. Your medical records match perfectly the burns on your back, the timing, everything. But your military service was classified, and I had no way to find you. Until you were captured doing something noble again. Exactly what I would have expected of you. Keshin wanted to argue, wanted to deny the connection she was describing, because it didn't align with his understanding of his own timeline. And yet, something in him recognized the truth of what she was saying. He could almost remember it, could almost feel the sensation of a presence beside him. Something warm and alive that wasn't his own team. During those final moments before extraction. If you knew, he said slowly, why the interrogation? Why the formal charges? Thalia Vex's expression became complicated, and he realized for the first time that she was truly torn about something. Because I'm the tribunal representative, and protocol demands verification. Because my position makes it impossible for me to simply release someone on personal recognition. Because ... She paused, and her next words came out quieter. Because I needed to be absolutely certain before I did what I've already decided to do. And what's that? Keshin asked. Overturn your conviction and offer you something far more interesting than freedom, she said. But first, you need to remember. You need to know what I know. And then you need to decide whether you want to help me change something fundamental about how our two peoples interact with each other. Keshin realized his hands were shaking. You're asking me to change everything based on a shared memory that I can barely access. No, Thalia said softly. I'm asking you to change everything based on the person you've already proven you are. Twice. The memory is just confirmation. She extended her hand to him, and Keshin stared at it for a long moment. Taking that hand would mean accepting the connection she was describing. It would mean committing to something he didn't fully understand. It would mean stepping away from the safety of his current trajectory and into something far less certain. He took her hand. Her skin was warm and held a faint luminescence where they made contact. Her fingers were delicate but strong, and when she squeezed gently, Keshin felt the weight of 7 years of searching, of waiting, of holding on to a voice she thought she might never hear again. Tell me everything, he said. Every detail you remember. Because if this is real, if I really saved your life, then I need to understand what that means now. Thalia Vex smiled again, that genuine expression that changed her entire face. It means, Captain Veo, that fate has a sense of irony. It means we're going to do something that neither the human coalition nor the tribunal authority expects. And it means that the person I've spent 7 years wondering about is finally standing in front of me, willing to listen. They walked deeper into the gardens, their hands still connected, and Keshin found himself beginning to remember fragments of sensation and emotion that suddenly aligned with the reality of the woman beside him. The impossible colors of an alien sky, the weight of someone depending on him, the sound of a voice speaking words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Gratitude, recognition, connection. By the time they reached the center of the gardens, where a small pool reflected the artificial sky above, Keshin understood that his detention had never been about smuggling charges at all. It had been about Thalia Vex bringing him back into her orbit, finally bridging the distance that 7 years and bureaucratic secrecy had created between them. What happens now? He asked. Now, Thalia said, turning to face him fully, we convince the galaxy that 2 people from different worlds might have something to teach everyone about how to coexist. And we do it without anyone realizing that we've already begun falling in love with each other. Keshin felt his heart stop for a moment. Is that what we're doing? Isn't it? She asked. How else would you describe this? I've searched for you for 7 years. You risked your career to save me when I was nothing but a stranger in need. If that's not the foundation of love, I don't know what is. Keshin kissed her then, because it seemed like the only response that could possibly be adequate. And as she responded, her hands moving to his shoulders, Keshin realized that sometimes fate doesn't simply repeat itself. Sometimes it offers you a second chance at something you never knew you'd lost. The palace gardens occupied the highest level of the tribunal station, a sprawling expanse of cultivated life that defied the sterile nature of orbital habitats. Thalia had brought Keshin here deliberately, not to hide, but because this was where she did her best thinking. The place held no official designation, no security protocols beyond the standard biometric locks. It was simply hers, a refuge from the political machinery that consumed most of her waking hours. They'd been meeting in secret for 2 weeks now, slipping away through maintenance corridors and diplomatic channels that Thalia's position gave her access to. Keshin had been moved to legitimate quarters, his status upgraded from prisoner to honored guest under tribunal protection. The official story was vague enough to avoid scrutiny, a misunderstanding, diplomatic immunity, the kind of bureaucratic resolution that nobody questioned too closely, because the machinery of government preferred to move forward rather than examine the mechanisms that drove it. But the world beyond this garden was beginning to notice, and that was the problem. My advisor approached me this morning, Thalia said, trailing her fingers across the bioluminescent flowers that only bloomed in twilight hours. He's concerned about the time I'm spending away from official duties. He's concerned about a lot of things, actually. Keshin sat on the curved bench beneath an ancient tree that had been cultivated on this station for 40 years. His dark hair had grown out slightly since his detention, and Thalia found she preferred it that way. It made him look less like the careful, regulated person she'd seen in the interrogation chamber, and more like the man she actually knew, someone willing to bend rules, to sacrifice comfort for principle, to choose compassion over protocol. "Let me guess," Keshin said. "He's concerned about me specifically, about the nature of our interactions." He used the phrase inappropriate entanglement, Thalia confirmed. She turned to face him fully, and the setting sun caught the faint iridescence of her skin, turning it into something almost ethereal. The tribunal authority doesn't take kindly to its representatives developing personal relationships with individuals under their jurisdiction. It compromises objectivity. It creates conflicts of interest. "Except I'm not actually under your jurisdiction anymore," Keshin pointed out. "My charges were dropped. I'm a free agent, technically." "Politically, you're something far more complicated," Thalia said, moving to sit beside him. "You're a human in a tribunal station. You're someone I recognized from a past incident that some would argue I should have reported formally rather than investigated privately. And most significantly, you're someone I've been seeing entering my private chambers on multiple occasions." Keshin reached for her hand as she let him take it. Her fingers were cool against his palm, and there was something grounding about the contact. "What do you want to do?" The question was simple, but it contained multitudes. Thalia understood that he wasn't asking what she thought was strategically wise or politically expedient. He was asking what she actually wanted, what her genuine desire was beneath all the layers of duty and expectation. "I want to stop hiding," she said quietly. "I want to tell them that we met 7 years ago, that you saved my life, and that I've spent every day since searching for you. I want to stop pretending that what we're building is something less significant than it actually is." "And the consequences?" Keshin asked. "Substantial," Thalia admitted. "The tribunal authority would demand investigation into whether my personal relationship with you has compromised any of my official decisions. The human coalition would want to know if there's some hidden agenda behind my involvement in your case. Both sides would scrutinize our connection for any hint of manipulation or inappropriate influence. And most importantly, my political enemies would use this to undermine my credibility." Keshin was quiet for a long moment. "What do your political enemies want to accomplish?" "Mostly, they want to prevent the initiative I've been designing," Thalia explained. "A joint humanitarian corps human and tribunal representatives working together in contested zones, saving lives without political calculation. It's something I've been planning for years, but I lacked the right catalyst, the right symbol to make both sides accept it." Keshin's expression shifted. "You're not thinking of using us as that symbol, are you? Our relationship as some kind of propaganda for—" "No," Thalia interrupted, and there was genuine hurt in her voice. "That's not what this is. That's not what you are to me. But I won't lie and say that the symbolic value of what we represent isn't significant. Two people from different worlds, different species, choosing each other despite everything working against us. Yes, that could inspire something meaningful. But that would only work if it's genuine, which means we can't manufacture it for political purposes. So what you're saying," Keshin said slowly, "is that we have to decide whether we're willing to have our relationship examined under public scrutiny, knowing that people will try to use it for purposes we don't control." "Yes," Thalia said, "and more than that. If we do this, if we make our relationship public and official, we're essentially committing to the larger vision I've been working toward. We're saying that our connection means something not just to U.S., but to the broader framework of how our peoples interact. That's a heavy weight to place on something that's still so new." Keshin stood and began to pace, the same way Thalia had seen him do when he was thinking through complex problems. Tell me about the initiative, the humanitarian course. What would it actually accomplish? Thalia took a breath. She'd prepared this explanation 100 times in her mind, but saying it aloud felt different. More real, more consequential. Both the Tribunal Authority and the Human Coalition maintain jurisdictions in what we call the buffer zones regions, of space that are technically disputed, but controlled by neither side. These zones are filled with colonies that have been abandoned by larger governmental structures because they're not economically valuable. People are dying there, not from warfare, but from neglect. Medical shortages, equipment failures, supply chain collapses. Like Meridian Station, Keshin said. Exactly like Meridian Station, Thalia confirmed. Your arrest wasn't random. The authorities have been watching independent traders like you for years. They know you run supplies to these forgotten places, and they've been trying to decide whether to prosecute you or recruit you. And you chose recruitment, Keshin said. I chose to find a way that doesn't involve coercion, Thalia corrected gently. A joint initiative where humans and tribunal members work together under official sanction would legitimize what you've been doing. It would give people like you the resources to actually help, rather than forcing you to operate in shadows. More importantly, it would demonstrate that cooperation across our species lines is possible, and more than that beneficial. Keshin returned to the bench and sat beside her again. Your enemies in the Tribunal Authority, they oppose this because cooperation with humans threatens their power base. They want isolation, conflict, clearly defined hierarchies. They want certainty, Thalia said, and cooperation creates ambiguity. It's harder to maintain authority when your people are working alongside the representatives of your supposed rival. It creates connections, personal relationships, relationships exactly like ours, which is why some of them are terrified of what we represent. And if we go public, Keshin said, if we make our relationship official, we become the proof of concept. We become the evidence that this works. We become the symbol, Thalia agreed. And that means every difficulty we face, every conflict, every moment of disagreement becomes political commentary. Our relationship becomes public property, analyzed for meaning, weaponized by whoever needs a weapon. Keshin was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I didn't think about that when I was running supplies to Meridian Station. I was just trying to help people. I didn't consider the larger political implications. And now? Thalia asked gently. Now I'm considering them, Keshin said. And I'm realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not hide from those implications, but step directly into them. If staying quiet about what we are to each other means that other people like you don't get the resources to help dying colonies, then my comfort doesn't matter much, does it? Thalia felt her heart constrict. This was why she'd searched for him for 7 years. This was why, the moment she heard his voice in that interrogation chamber, she knew she'd found something essential. Keshin didn't think small. He didn't choose the safe path. You're asking me to be brave, she said. No, Keshin replied. I'm asking us to both be brave, together. He kissed her then, and it felt different from their previous kisses. There was determination in it, and commitment, and a willingness to accept whatever came next. When they separated, Thalia felt like something had shifted irrevocably in their trajectory. We need to do this carefully, she said. We need to control the narrative as much as possible. We need to announce this ourselves before someone else does it for us in a way that serves their interests. How? Keshin asked. We convene an official tribunal session, Thalia said, her mind already working through the logistics. We request joint human tribunal authority representation, and we present the humanitarian initiative with you as its proposed coordinator. When they ask about our relationship, we tell them the truth. All of it. The 7-year search, The recognition, everything. They'll question whether my involvement in the initiative is a conflict of interest, Keshin warned. Of course, Thalia said, which is why we'll propose a governing structure that removes that accusation. Independent oversight, rotating leadership, external review boards. We make the program stronger by addressing the conflict head-on rather than hiding from it. Keshin pulled her close, and Thalia felt the familiar comfort of his presence. This was what she'd been searching for in military records and classified files, not just a name or a voice, but the person behind them. Someone who could stand beside her and make her vision possible. When? Keshin asked. Soon, Thalia said, before my enemies mobilize their own response to our relationship. We move with intention and honesty, or we get moved by others with neither. They sat together in the fading light of the artificial sunset, watching the bioluminescent flowers bloom more fully as darkness approached. In a few days, their private world would become very public. Their relationship would be dissected and analyzed and weaponized. But sitting here now, with Keshin's arm around her shoulders, and the weight of 7 years of searching finally resolved into presence, Thalia felt something unexpected. She felt ready. The morning of the tribunal hearing arrived with the kind of austere efficiency that characterized all formal governmental proceedings. Thalia dressed in her official regalia, the formal robes of a tribunal representative, woven with symbols that denoted her authority and status. Her elaborate braids had been restyles into the traditional configuration worn only during important proceedings. She looked every inch the powerful official she actually was. Keshin waited in the anteroom wearing clothing Thalia had helped him select human formal wear, but tailored and refined in a way that suggested someone comfortable with both his origins and his current context. He looked nervous, which made him human in the most essential way. We can still call this off, Thalia said one final time. We can take more time to prepare, to strategize. No, Keshin said firmly. Delay is just another way of hiding. We do this now, or we never actually do it. The tribunal chamber was vast and formal, designed to intimidate anyone brought before it. Thalia had presented cases here hundreds of times, but today felt fundamentally different. Today, she was the one exposing herself to scrutiny. Today, she was choosing vulnerability alongside her authority. She presented the humanitarian initiative first, laying out the data regarding colony casualties in buffer zones, the economic argument for joint intervention, the strategic benefits to both the human coalition and the tribunal authority. She was articulate and compelling, and she could see some of the assembled tribunal members beginning to understand the vision. Then she stopped and said the words that would change everything. This initiative would not exist without the cooperation of an individual from the human coalition, specifically Captain Keshin VOR, who is present here today. Before you consider his role in this program, you should know the full context of our relationship. She told them everything. The incident 7 years ago, the search, the recognition. She spoke with the precision of a tribunal representative, but with the vulnerability of a woman who had found what she thought she'd lost. When she finished, the chamber was absolutely silent. Then the questions began. They were aggressive, skeptical, designed to find hidden agendas and compromise judgment. Keshin answered each one with steady honesty, never deflecting, never embellishing, simply stating facts and allowing people to draw their own conclusions. By the time the hearing concluded, Thalia wasn't certain whether they had succeeded or simply accelerated their own political destruction. But she was certain of one thing: they had done it together, and that mattered more than outcome. As they left the chamber, hand in hand, she heard the whispers beginning. Not all of them were hostile. Some sounded almost hopeful, as though seeing two people from different worlds choose each other had stirred something in those who witnessed it. That night, in Thalia's private quarters, Keshin held her as she processed the weight of what they'd done. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Thalia said, "we wait to see if our bridge between worlds is strong enough to support the weight of both our people's expectations." Keshin kissed the top of her head. "And if it's not? Then at least we didn't lose each other trying," Thalia replied. And in the darkness of the orbital station, suspended between two worlds, that was enough.